Evening with a Legend is a series of presentations exclusive to legends of the famous 24 Hours of Le Mans, giving us an opportunity to bring a piece of Le Mans to you. By sharing stories and highlights of the big event, you get a chance to become part of the legend of Le Mans with guests from different eras of over 100 years of racing.
Tonight, we have an opportunity to bring a piece of Le Mans to you, sharing in the legend of Le Mans with guests from different eras of over 100 years of racing. And as your host, I'm delighted to introduce Hurley Haywood, a name synonymous with endurance racing excellence. Over the course of 13 attempts at the legendary 24 Hours of Le Mans, Hurley cemented his legacy as one of the greatest sports car drivers of all time. From his debut in 1977 to his final start in 1994, Hurley was more than just a driver. He was a force to be reckoned with. Whether battling through the night or sharing the cockpit with icons like Jackie Ickx and Holbert, his impact on endurance racing is undeniable. With 3 overall victories and 5 podium finishes, all behind the wheel of a Porsche, his story is one of relentless determination, precision, and uncanny ability to push both man and machine to their limits. We'll break down his Le Mans career, the highs, the lows, and what made Hurley Haywood a legend in the world of Le Mans and beyond. And with that, I'm your host, Crew Chief Eric from the Motoring Podcast Network, welcoming everyone to this Evening with a Legend. Hurley, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You have the most attempts so far of any guest on an Evening with a Legend. 13 total, 3 wins, 5 podiums between 77 and 94. And since we can't cover them all, let's quickly talk about your journey up to Le Mans and how the deal was put together and talk about some of the highlights.
Joe Hoppen, who was in charge of both Audi and racing here in the United States, called me up one afternoon and said, "How would you like to go to Le Mans?" And I said, "Fantastic, sign me up." He arranged with Porsche to have me drive on the factory team.
Was that the first time you had raced in Europe?
Yes, that was the first time I'd raced in Europe. Now, you got to remember, the only really reference I had to Le Mans was the movie Le Mans. Read about it in magazines, and I never really sought out what the city of Le Mans was like. So when I flew over, I flew into Charles de Gaulle, rented a car, and drove to Le Mans. Well, I was shocked. Le Mans is a huge city, very industrial, and I was completely lost. I didn't speak very good French. I was just kind of driving around trying to find something that I could recognize. And nighttime fell, and I was driving down this little alley. There was a guy with a Porsche jacket on, and I said, "Can you help me find where Porsche is?" So he looked in the window and he says, "Here, Haywood, we've been wondering where you are." And it turns out that this guy was Klaus Bischoff, who was my crew chief for the car. And he says, "You got to come into the bar and meet the guys that are going to be working on your cars." I'd been up for like 36 hours, so I was kind of a walking zombie. And to make it simple, he said, "We're not going to try to tell you how to get to your hotel. We'll take you to the cathedral where the tech inspection was the next day. You can sleep in the back seat and the Porsche guys will find you. I'll tell them that you're there." So that's exactly what happened. And that morning, there was a loud knock on the windshield, and it happened to be Manfred Janka, who was head of the racing program. He said, where the hell have you been?" So that was my introduction to Porsche. Nowadays, a newbie has to go through a whole regimen of testing, whether it's on a simulator, the rule book, lights, different caution lights, what that means, the controlled areas. If there's an incident, they don't close the whole track, but they close the area where the accident is. That being said, I really had no idea of what the track looked like. The practice starts at like 6 o'clock at night and runs to about midnight. They said, "Okay, now it's your turn." And it was pitch black. And they said, "We'll send Jackie Ickx out and you can follow him and he'll show you the way around." That was 2 laps, and then I was on my own. The average speed at that point was 165 miles an hour. That's pretty fast. So there's a lot of very fast straightaways. The Mulsanne straight is over 200 miles an hour. So I really had my hands full, but it kind of all worked out, and the team was really very gracious and very helpful, and they walked me through the protocols. But it was something that I was absolutely, completely unprepared for what happened after we won the race. I mean, there was tens of thousands of people just swarmed onto the pit lane. And the next day when I got to the airport, there was a mob of people there. So it was sort of surreal in its presentation. It was really shocking, but I got used to it and enjoyed it.
So let's unpack that first race. One of the questions that came up from a lot of the folks that are sitting in the audience, they wanted to know how it compared to racing at Daytona. And I know they're really night and day, but endurance racing as a whole, how was Le Mans in comparison to the 24 hours of Daytona?
Well, I'm often asked that question. Daytona is my home track. I'm 55 miles away from the speedway from my home. The races are so different. And, I'm often asked, what do I think is a harder race to win? And I've always said Daytona was harder because, one, the nighttime is 12 hours. They have a vast sort of arena of driver talent, some very professional guys and some real amateur people. So you never know who you're coming up to. That makes it difficult. Where Le Mans, they have very strict rules, and it's sort of the caliber of teams and drivers at the time I was racing there was much higher than in the United States. That has changed dramatically over the years and to our present situation where it's probably equal. But Le Mans is such a iconic race. And personally, I think racing at Daytona is more difficult. I asked Norbert Singer what he thought was more difficult. And he said, well, from a race strategy and from what happens in the race car, I think they're both pretty equal. What makes IMSA better or Daytona better is if you make a mistake, they bring you into the pits and they say, don't do that again. And if you do it again, you're going to be in serious trouble. Where at Le Mans, it's sometimes several minutes of discussion of what you've done, and making up that on a track is difficult to do. So he said, I think Le Mans is more difficult.
So you got a first impression of the track, you got a first impression of your Porsche teammates and the team, but you made a first impression on the French as well. I hear maybe this is legend, maybe this is a little myth busting here, but there's a story about a rubber band Rolex.
Roland Pouton, who was the president of Rolex in the United States, called me up and said, congratulations, that was wonderful. You did a great job over there. You had your arms raised up in the air, and I noticed that you didn't have a Rolex on. And I said, well, I didn't take my Rolexes over there because I didn't want to get them stolen. I didn't, so I went out and bought a Timex Ironman. He said, okay, that makes sense. So that next Christmas, Rolex had invited me up to New York for a luncheon. When dessert came, a box came with a Rolex in it with a rubber band on it. And he said, this is the least flashy watch that we can produce. Well, in hindsight, it was probably the watch that got the most amount of comments because where did you get that Rolex? Where did you get that rubber band? And so recently I became an official ambassador of Rolex. Back in 1991, it was a handshake, and that was all we needed. They were completely honest, and they were, really good to me and over the years. And Luca said, it's time that we signed you up with a bona fide contract. And I said, that's great. The contract was one page. Basically, the situation was that when you go in public, please wear a Rolex. And that was about it. So they're a great company to work for.
Talking about your 77 season again in the Porsche 936, Harley Cluxton wrote about his vantage point and competing against you with his team. And he said there were tons of challenges with the car, and yet you and Jackie and Jürgen Barth still managed to bring the car home for a win. So what was that like?
They gave me the honor of starting the race. And that's a pretty heavy weight on your shoulders when you're starting a race like that with no experience as far as the start goes. So we take off and the throttle sticks wide open in the first corner. I managed to get out of the way of everybody, get it slowed down. With the throttle stuck, you couldn't push the clutch down because you would over rev the motor. The first thing that came to my mind was hit the ignition switch. Well, I did that and I was in the grass and it was hard to sort of bump start the car again. I had to take off the rear bonnet. We had actually practiced taking off the rear bonnet to get to the engine, which was a mammoth thing. I mean, it probably weighed what that hood weighed, but I managed to get it off, found out where the problem was, got the throttle fixed, and got back in and started up and went back to the pits. I think we lost maybe 2 or 3 laps during that episode. I went back to the pits. They fixed it and everything was great. Jackie's car had a mechanical problem, and they moved Jackie over with Jürgen and myself. And Jackie is an absolute master at night and in the rain, because it always rains at some point during that race. And then when it rains, it doesn't rain on the whole track. It rains in portions on the track. So Jackie fought during the night. Jürgen and myself sort of was a backup. It all kind of worked out. Porsche really has a wonderful ability to put sort of like personalities together in the car. We're all secure with being racing drivers. We're not out there to prove who the fastest guy is. We're there to win the race, and everybody does the job that they're supposed to do. And that's been the case on all the cars I've ever driven for Porsche with teammates. It just was really special to win that race.
Well, I'm glad you brought up teammates because we're going to jump ahead of here a little bit. 1978 and 82, you podiumed. You come back in 1983 for your second win in the Porsche 956. And Mark Howell wrote, what was it like driving with Al Holbert and Vern Schuppen as teammates? How did your driving styles differ? How did your strengths work with each other or against each other?
I knew Al long before we raced together at Le Mans, and he is a great driver and a great friend. And he and I have sort of the same feeling for the cars, along with Vern. The three of us together made a really potent team. And the 956 was a difficult car to drive. The geometry on the car was, a lot of effort went into the steering. And IMSA would not allow that car to race in the States. They said, well, you got to get the driver's feet behind the front axle, thinking that Porsche would never do that. Well, that was how the 962 was developed. And they elongated the wheelbase, and that made all the difference in the world. That thing was just a sweetheart to drive. And it was kind of like a driver's dream come true. It had so much downforce that the cornering speeds were like on a railroad track. So it was really nice to drive that car.
Up until this point, you had the chance to race with some of the best drivers in the world as your teammates. Can you share some memorable experiences with your teammates that really stand out?
Can't even count how many drivers I've driven with, but guys I've driven with in the long distance races, we all kind of had the same mission motivating us, and that was to win the race. We weren't there to set the fastest time. We were there to do 0 mistakes and bring the car back in one piece. And we all kind of contributed to that thinking. And we would sit down after our practice sessions and kind of say, well, what are we going to do? We don't want to get into a wheel-to-wheel fight with somebody because that's when mistakes happen. It was kind of a feeling that we had. We were not sandbagging. We were not being easy with the car. We were being easy with the car, but not to the point of being slow with the car. That's kind of a very delicate balance where you're trying to be really quick but save the cars. Back then we didn't have sequential shifting, we didn't have power steering, we didn't have any of that stuff. It was all done by the driver, and it was very easy to exhaust yourself because the cars were pretty hot inside. We had to be careful with that, and in a 2-hour stint I would lose 5 pounds of sweat, and getting that liquid back into your system was sometimes a real problem. And one time I brought my doctor over. He said, well, the easy fix for that is hydration with an IV. Porsche saw how quickly I recovered with that, and they said, okay, it makes sense. Now that's not allowed because people are afraid that there'd be doping stuff in the mixture. But back then, it was a very efficient way to get back up to speed.
Later in the 83 season, you had a pretty bad accident at Motorsport, which kind of took you out of the Le Mans scene for the next couple of years. And that brings us to 1986. You're in the record books twice in the same year on the same team, and that's the Silk Cut Jaguars. How did that happen? How did that work out that you were running 2 cars over 24 hours?
Well, Tom Walkinshaw decided that they wanted to bring some very experienced drivers in long distance. So they got Brian Redman and myself to come. And before that happened, I had broken my leg back in 1983. Bob Tullius called up Al Holbert, and he said, I'm thinking about hiring Hurley because he can't push the clutch down on a Porsche, but we have a Hewland gearbox and he only has to push the clutch to get in and out of the pits. And Al said to Bob, he said, if you can hire Hurley, do it today because he's one of the best. And that's exactly what happened. So I raced for the Jaguar team, the Tullius team, Group 44, for 2.5 years. And then when that program stopped and it moved over to Walkinshaw decided that he wanted Brian Redmond and myself to come help his team win the race. Well, we were told basically to keep our mouths shut and drive as fast as we could go because he wanted to be on television at the start of the race. And so eventually all 3 cars had mechanical problems and we would move from one car to the other car. And so I don't want to get into the particulars, but it was kind of an amusing roundtable of guys that were going from one car to another car, and then that car would break and move to the third car. So it was a difficult situation to be in.
And this was during a time when the driver stints weren't as limited as they are today. You had minimum driving times, but you didn't have maximum driving times. So you're able to jump between the 2 cars.
Yeah, correct.
So what was it like driving the Jags compared to the Porsches you had run in the past?
They're going to hate me when I say this, but it was like a truck. It was very loud, very guttural. I mean, it was not a difficult car to drive, but it was like Hot Rod City. The thing sounded really great, deafening almost. And it was sort of not as sophisticated as the Group 44 car was. Group 44 car had that 12-cylinder. It was a beautiful sounding engine. Lee Dykstra was the one that designed it. And, it was a really nice car. And then when we went back to drive the Walkinshaw car, it was just dramatically different. I'm not saying it was worse or better, but it was just very different.
So you've mentioned Bob Tullius and Group 44 a couple of times here, and that brings us to 1987, one of my favorite years of racing in general. At the same time that you were still racing at Le Mans, doing endurance racing, you started with Bob and the Audi program in Trans Am, bringing the Quattros to road racing. So what was it like jumping between the Audis and the 962s? And at that time, did you prefer one over the other?
Well, let me back up a little bit. When Bob Tullius lost the Jaguar deal, at the same time, Audi was thinking about coming in to race in the United States, and they wanted to sort of promote the Audi program. And Joe Hoppen was, of course, the guy that sort of negotiated all the rules and everything. He called me up and he said, well, what do you think we should do? What team do you think we should get? And I said, well, get Tullius. He's got all the equipment. He's got the shop. He's got the transporters. They're all spotless, totally in the Audi sort of way of thinking. And so that's what happened. And he got the deal, and everybody went over to Ingolstadt to talk about the program and, work out the details. But that was one of the greatest cars. Everybody laughed, said, what are you doing with driving a basically sedan? And they stopped laughing after the first race because we were just so superior to everything else on the racetrack. And then when Trans Am kicked us out of Trans Am because the cars were so good, that we moved over to IMSA. The cars were not really made to do long distance races, so we didn't do Daytona, we didn't do Sebring. But then, I think Stuck won almost every race, and I was second in all those races. So that thing was unbelievable. 700 horsepower, huge tires on the front and rear, and it was really a pretty cool car to drive.
And the reason I bring it up is that wouldn't be the last time you drove with Hans Stuck and Walter Röhrl. And if we jump forward a little bit and then we'll dance back, you actually ran in 1993 with Hans and Walter at Le Mans in a 911 Turbo. Was that part of this whole Group 44 contract? How did that come to be?
No, it didn't have anything to do with the contract with Group 44. It was like a prototype 911 that we raced at Daytona and Sebring, I think. It was really fast. It was really a great car. And then we were also going to race that car at Le Mans with Stuck, myself, and Walter. That was the race, if my memory is correct, was the race that Walter retired after. So that was the end of that program. That was a really cool car, really fast.
Did you guys choose to drive together, or was that preordained?
It was preordained. They wanted an American, which was me, and Walter, of course, and Hans were great friends and fantastic drivers and very fast. So we were kicking ass in Daytona, and then we had I think Danny Sullivan drove with us at Daytona. So there was four guys on the team at Daytona. And a mechanical failure, we were out of the race. We were leading at the time.
Now, as we jump back into the early 90s, you returned to Le Mans many times, again behind the wheel of Porsche 962s. And we're going to talk specifically about 1994. That's lucky number 13, your final win at Le Mans in LMP1 with a 962 LM at the age of 46.
Well, the car that we ran in 94 was a Dower car. And the Dower car was a 962 that was made for the street. And Norbert Singer found a loophole in the rules that all we had to do to make that car legal was to eliminate the ground effects. And we did a lot of testing in the wind tunnel. We did a lot of testing on tracks. We went to, I think, Paul Ricard or Manicourt and did 24-hour tests with that car. So it was really a nice car to drive. It was very fast on the straightaway because it didn't have a lot of downforce. So that was really cool. And so we went testing. I can't remember. I think it was Manicourt that we were testing that. And I was scheduled to drive with Stuck and Terry Boutsen, I think, and myself. And then Mero Baldi and Yannick Damas were going to drive with Danny Sullivan. After the test, Yannick and Mauro went to the factory and had a seat designed for them. Well, they were the same size as I was. So when Sullivan got to the track on race day, on race practice, he couldn't get in their seat. He was too big. So they said, oh, we'll fix that. We'll just move Hurley over and he can drive with those guys and Sullivan can drive with Stuck and Boutsen. So that's how that happened. And that was literally one of the very few races that I've ever had a seat that fit me properly. Usually I was just sort of hanging on because the seats were always big and they would always have to put in a big clumsy insert and you never really felt comfortable with those cars. But that time the seat was perfect. We would do driver changes and we wouldn't have to adjust the belts at all. So that was really special. And it showed when we won. I mean, it was really a great car.
Did you want to run again after 94 or were you, after 13 tries, you were done?
After 94, Porsche changed over to production cars, GT cars. I had made a promise to myself because of the speed difference between the prototypes and the GT cars that I would not ever drive a GT car at Le Mans. Daytona is different, but Le Mans, I said no. And Porsche didn't really have a prototype to race except the GT1. I can't remember what they called it, but it was a great car. But I was kind of out of the loop at that point. So I can't remember even who drove that car.
Well, I'm going to pull a question from the crowd here, and this can apply to any Porsche you've ever driven. Scott writes, which Porsche variant was the most fun to drive? Not necessarily the fastest, but the one you enjoyed the most.
The 936. That was the car that I won Le Mans with the first time. It had a really beautiful engine. The car was beautiful to look at. Had the big shovel above your head. Because it didn't have ground effects, it moved around a lot. It's kind of like driving a really powerful 911. You could adjust with your throttle what the rear of the car was doing, but not in an uncontrolled manner. It was just a really pleasant car to drive. And I like open cars.
You talked a little bit about the challenges of driving at Le Mans, and weather is something that comes up all the time. And then mechanical sympathy is another one, being cognizant of the car and the other drivers. And, you need to make it to the end. You can't win Le Mans on turn one. A lot of the legends that come on the show, we actually talked to them about how the experience of Le Mans changed them as a driver. And you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that Le Mans was the first time you had raced in Europe. And again, first impressions are lasting impressions. So how do you feel that Le Mans changed you, maybe your driving style? What did you bring home from every time you raced at Le Mans?
Well, you got to remember that prior to 1977, I had won 3 Daytona 24-hour races. So the 24-hour format was not something that was alien to me. The same principles that hold true for being successful at Daytona hold true for being successful at Le Mans. So my driving style, the way I thought, the way I trained, didn't really change that much. The only thing that really changed was we had great food.
So when you look at Le Mans changes and its evolution, you started in the pre-chicane days, and then in 1990 through 1994, you drove in the new format. How was that for you? Did you have to really relearn the track, or was it always about the same?
The speed difference between no chicanes and chicanes was almost the same. It was well over 200 miles an hour between the chicanes. But because of the chicanes, the physical exertion of those two entities was pretty severe. The braking was massive. You really had to come in on the brakes. And I think that that was in itself something that really took a toll on drivers and cars. I much preferred the no chicanes, but the tire manufacturers just were not comfortable with that sustained speed with their product. And I think that they were pretty instrumental in getting the track to put the chicanes in. Same thing at Daytona. With the bus stop at Daytona, would enter turn three at over 200 miles an hour on the banking with a lot of downforce and a lot of force on the tires. So they went to the speedway and said, we need to put a chicane in there to slow the cars down on the entries into three. So that, I think, worked well for them.
As one of the most successful American drivers at Le Mans, what do you think Le Mans means for motorsport in the United States? And as Le Mans has evolved, how do you feel about the global recognition of Le Mans?
Well, I think cars now, both on the US side and on the European side, are very similar to each other. They have a little bit different rule package, but I think the end result is really good for racing because in my day, we would win these long distance races by laps, by miles. And now at Daytona and at Le Mans, you have multiple cars that are on the same lap after 24 hours. So I think that that is something that's good. I like to be dominant. I like to win those races by large margins. But I think from the fan standpoint, it's better that you have multiple cars on the same lap in both prototype and in GT. And that just makes for a good show.
So there's a lot of young drivers that are coming up through the system now that have Le Mans as one of their crown jewels. And so looking back over all your entries at Le Mans and even over your career, what advice would you give to young aspiring drivers who dream of competing at the 24 and following in your footsteps?
I think this new generation of drivers is amazing. Their maturity behind the wheel, how they deal with all the pressures are mind-boggling, really. I looked at kind of what I was like in that era. It's just a completely different mindset of these young kids. And they're super fast. They don't make mistakes. They understand the engineering of the cars. Peter Gregg once told me, he said, you are hired as a driver. Don't try to be an engineer. Articulate what the car is doing and then let the engineers figure out what to do. And I think that that is the case on many of the young drivers that are in the sport right now. They're very articulate. They know what they're doing, and they're only going to get better with time. So I think the future of racing, the next generation of superstars is going to come from the current crop, both the European and on the American side.
So having returned to Le Mans many times, you've seen a lot of change, as we talked about, with the change of the course configuration itself. What are some of the best new things that had come to Le Mans since you had started there in 77?
The pits were like, you would make a pit stop and there would be literally hundreds of people that you would have to dodge through to get into your pit slot to make the pit stop. It was just so overwhelming with the crowd of people that was allowed into the pits. So that's when they built the new pits and the new boxes above the pits. That was really special. And that made it much, much safer and much more enjoyable.
Got a couple of crowd questions here. Terry Johnson writes, with all the modern day advancement in telemetry, communication, and all the cockpit gadgets for the driver, do you see your era as more pure in terms of racing?
Absolutely. I'm not a big fan of electronics controlling the cars. I like to be in control of what is going on with the car. And if I want something, I'll radio into the pits and I'll say, okay, the car's understeering. What are we going to do about it? Now, all of that is already known with telemetry. They're not necessarily relying on what the driver says. They know what he's going to say. We didn't have sequential shifting. We didn't have ABS brakes. We didn't have power steering. We didn't have air-conditioned cockpits. I'm not saying it's any easier now. I think with the introduction of all the commands from the pits to the drivers on what to do to save energy. The formula for fuel usage and electricity has to be dissipated at the same time. So if you come into the pits and they see that the battery's been zero, you're penalized. That's why it's so important to listen to the engineers. They're telling you you're using too much fuel, you're using too much battery, dial back a little bit. It's a constant thing. So it's not just one lap they're doing it almost every lap. So I don't think I could drive a race car with having somebody talking to me all the time.
So along with that, Greg Caruso writes, what's the biggest difference you see in today's endurance racing compared to when you were racing? Is it safety? Is it something you already mentioned, or is it something else?
It's all of those things. Because the cars are so strong and so safe, it sort of gives the drivers this secure feeling that if something goes wrong, I'm not going to hurt myself. In my generation, people got hurt in race cars. People got killed in race cars. I think that tempered the way we looked at things and how we analyzed what kind of risks are we going to take. Now, in a 24-hour race, it's 24 segments of 100% performance. And there's no regard for being careful with the car. You can throw it around, you can bump into somebody and you're not going to damage the bodywork. They're very strong cars. And the safety equipment is phenomenal. Helmet technology and race suit technology is really good. Bladder control on the fuel tanks is good. So it's a much secure and safer environment. And that makes the racing better and safer. You want to be as safe as you possibly can, but because it's safe, there is sort of that feeling that I'm invincible, and that's a bad thing to feel, I think.
Tom Stout asks, any advice on visiting Le Mans as a spectator?
Go with somebody that knows the ropes. Take a friend or somebody that's been there before. It's overwhelming how large it is. Unless you know the systems, it's really difficult to navigate. There's a lot of different programs that have space in their formula that you go over. The airlines are paid for, the hotel, the food, the restaurants, the tickets for the race, where you're going to watch the race from. Those are really important because there is a language barrier. Unless, the person that lives in the United States speaks fluent French, it can be a real nightmare.
So I'm going to slide in another member question here. Leon Carson writes, and I'm sure you get this all the time, of all the tracks you've driven, what track do you enjoy driving on the most?
I love Watkins Glen. Watkins Glen is, that's what was the first racetrack I ever won a race with. Peter Gregg and myself won the GT portion in 1969. I was sitting on cloud nine, and then a couple of weeks after the race was over, I got my draft notice, and I was on an airplane flying to Vietnam in November. So that sort of cut my racing career till 1971. Peter Gregg said, "Don't worry, you have a job when you get back." And I rotated out of the Army in 71, and we won the first race at VIR. So that was great of Peter to be patient.
Watkins Glen definitely at the top of my list. Making my heart smile there, Hurley. I appreciate that.
Good.
Now that the Le Mans Classic is back, any plans to return to Le Mans? And if you were going to go back, would you race any of your previous cars or maybe something else, something you competed against?
I would not want to race the cars. We have a lot of cars in our collection here in Jacksonville at the Brumos collection. We exercise those cars, we demonstrate those cars, but we don't race those cars. When I hung up my helmet in 2012, I just said, competitive racing is just not in the bucket list at this point.
Do you still enjoy watching races like Le Mans, the 24 Hours of Daytona? Does it still get you revved up like you would want to be on track?
I'm on the sort of the management part of different teams. They ask my advice, and I'm busy being an ambassador for Porsche and being an ambassador for Rolex. So this last year we had a lot of Rolex people coming to the race, dealers. I was with them sort of explaining what was going on, and I enjoy doing that. And, the insight that you give to these customers that are really not too used to racing is invaluable. And I think Rolex is the brand in practically every major sport in existence. And motorsport is very lucky to have them as a sponsor, as a supporter, and the same quality that is involved in building a watch is the same as building a race car. You have to be absolutely 100% precise.
The popularity of Le Mans continues to grow. And this year, there were some big announcements as we proceed into the next couple of seasons. Ford is coming back, Aston is coming back. You've got all sorts of other brands coming to Le Mans and talking about coming to Le Mans. And it almost reminds me of the heyday of your time racing at Le Mans, where the LMP field was absolutely huge and the competition was strong as it ever was. So it makes me wonder, if you could go back to Le Mans today and you could get behind the wheel of a car, is the obvious choice the 963, or is there something else that you'd be interested in taking a lap around the track in?
It would be hard to beat the 963. That thing is awesome. Nick Tandy is a friend, and he said it's really beautiful to drive that car. So if I went back to Le Mans and if I was going to drive something, it would be the 963.
No more questions from the crowd at this time. So what I'm going to do is pass the torch to David Lowe, ACO USA president, for some parting thoughts.
Hurley, on behalf of the ACO and the members of the ACO USA, thank you so much for your time this evening for an incredible interview. And again, thank you for visiting us at our meetup at Daytona. It was also a pleasure to meet you there. All the best.
I enjoyed that, and please give my best to all the ACO people.
Thank you, sir.
Yep.
From his 3 unforgettable wins to the podium finishes that defined an era, Hurley's legacy with Porsche and with the 24 Hours of Le Mans is nothing short of legendary. His determination, skill, and unyielding spirit have inspired generations of racers, and it's clear why he's considered one of the all-time greats in endurance racing. Whether you're a Porsche fan, a motorsports enthusiast, or someone who simply loves a great story of perseverance, Hurley Haywood's journey at Le Mans is one for the ages. And with that, we hope you enjoyed this presentation and look forward to more Evening with a Legend throughout the season. And on behalf of everyone here and those listening at home, thank you, Hurley, for sharing your stories with us.
Well, thank you, Eric. You did a good job with the questions, and I enjoyed the interview.
I want to have you back for some Audi talk, all right?
All right.
This episode has been brought to you by the Automobile Club of the West and the ACO USA. From the awe-inspiring speed demons that have graced the track to the courageous drivers who have pushed the limits of endurance, the 24 Hours of Le Mans is an automotive spectacle like no other. For over a century, the 24 Hours Le Mans has urged manufacturers to innovate for the benefit of future motorists, and it's a celebration of the relentless pursuit of speed and excellence in the world of motorsports. To learn more about or to become a member of the ACO USA, look no further than www.lemans.org. Click on English in the upper right corner, and then click on the ACO Members tab for club offers. Once you've become a member, you can follow all the action on the Facebook group ACO USA Members Club and become part of the legend with future Evening with the Legend meetups. This episode has been brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports as part of our Motoring Podcast Network. For more episodes like this, tune in each week for more exciting and educational content from organizations like the Exotic Car Marketplace, the Motoring Historian, Break Fix, and many others. If you'd like to support Grand Touring Motorsports and the Motoring Podcast Network, sign up for one of our many sponsorship tiers at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. Please note that the content, opinions, and materials presented and expressed in this episode are those of its creator, and this episode has been published with their consent. If you have any inquiries about this program, please contact the creators of this episode via email or social media as mentioned in the episode.